Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society podcast. Have you ever come across something and thought, I'm not smart enough for this? We think the fault lies with those who present information in ways which are hard to understand. In an attempt to change this, we'll be speaking to researchers, experts, and all-round wrinkly-brained individuals, improving our understanding of a broad range of topics which are rooted in psychology. Join us as we try to develop ourselves one brain fold at a time.
Please note that the Smooth Brain Society podcast is distinct from the Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington. The views expressed on this show are those of our guests, presenters, and affiliates alone, and we assume no liability for the application of the information discussed. We also take no responsibility for any change in brain folds on part of the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Now on to the podcast. Welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. Today, our topic of discussion will be around rituals and ritualistic practices. And to do that, we have with us Assistant Professor from Dublin City University, Dr. Johannes Karl. Dr. Karl was a former lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. His research focuses on the origin and expression of individual differences in personality and values. His ongoing research projects include quantitative approaches to philosophy as a way of life and the use of network statistics in cross-cultural psychology and state-trait interactions of mindfulness. So, welcome to the Smooth Brain Society, Dr. Karl.
Thank you for having me.
Every episode, I try to start off with like a quote in a different language because now it's become a thing. And for ritualistic practices, I found this this quote in Malay, which goes, Alang alang menuluk pekasam, biar sampai ke pangkal lengan, which translates to, if you're willing to reach into the fermented fish jar, you should just put your whole arm in.
That's actually practically good advice.
Yeah. So with that in mind, of course, I forgot to say that Olivia's with us as well.
Oh yeah, I'm back again.
So might as well take it away then.
Okay. What should we start with? I guess for most of our podcasts, we start with a bit of a background. So you grew up in Germany, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Germany. Technically speaking, I grew up in Bavaria, which is the south part of Germany. So if you think about anything German, Oktoberfest, Lederhosen, people standing in the mountains and playing the German version of the didgeridoo, that's Bavaria.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with that, how did you get into your field of research from humble beginnings?
That's an actually interesting question. So originally, I wanted to be a biologist. The only issue is that my wife was already a biologist, and I lagged 1 year behind her, and so I didn't want to go to the same university as her into the same course, because at some point she would have tutored me, and it would have been just extremely weird. So via extremely roundabout ways, I got into IO psychology. So I did IO psychology, I did a bit of consultancy.
That's industrial.
Yeah, that's industrial organization. So I did HR stuff. And from that, I got interested in how different people are essentially expressing personality or interacting with different artifacts. I did some stuff on gamification, so on how you use... If you think about it, video games are essentially just glorified Excel tables. It's people sitting at a screen, clicking a button 5,000 times, and then a number pops up and tells them that they won. And they find it extremely engaging. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you sit 5,000 hours in front of your Excel sheet, you feel extremely sad afterwards. But if you think about it, it's the same thing, just the veneer around it is quite different. And so there has been a movement in the past trying to understand why people find, for example, games engaging and other tasks not. And I got really interested because it was mainly a Western-driven thing. And I got really interested in how other cultures see that. Because if you think about engage with video games, Western-produced games and non-Western games are often quite different in the way how they set up things, how they tell stories, around how characters are being built. And there was not a lot of it there. And so I got really interested in cross-cultural psychology and came over to Vic and did my MSc in cross-cultural psychology here, did later my PhD on mindfulness. There we go. That's what it's on. But I've always stayed in a very similar area. I've always been interested in essentially a multi-layered conception of the human being. So where you have biological influences and ecological influences on human beings that shape how we express our psychology, essentially what human beings do in this context, and then also on a higher level how cultures shape individuals' lives and individual psychology, and how all of those layers interact with each other to create the diversity we see in the world.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's something that a lot of psychologists consider as like the cultural context of a phenomenon?
Research on culture is actually not as common as you would like it to be. So the majority of research in psychology is done in the Western, and with Western we mean American, and with American we mean college students, with college students we mean white, and with white we mean the average psychology sample that you can imagine in your mind. And in the past, when researchers have done cross-culture or research across cultures, they've often done it in a very unsystematic way. So there have been movements in the past. So if you think about the Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology, they try to push it forward. But often when researchers have looked outside of their own cultural context, they have done it in those people are different from us, and therefore we should investigate it, but no real ordering framework behind that. And so psychology is still, especially in a lot of aspects, still extremely American focused, which is an issue.
Mm-hmm. And with gaming, how do people become addicted to it, or at least in the West?
Ooh, that's a fascinating question. I'm not an addiction researcher. So if you want to know that, you should probably ask Anne McCaskill, I assume. Some researchers that have looked into it have considered the idea that you're not getting specifically addicted to one thing. Like you're not getting addicted to gaming. You're not getting addicted to cigarettes. Your addiction expresses itself in a specific behavior. If I let my mind run free, like a lot of it is related to escapism. So you craft alternative worlds, you get alternative achievement experiences that you might not get in your day-to-day life. So it's easy to see why it can be engaging, because it is a rewarding experience. And especially now that, like, if you think about, if you remember the 90s,
No.
Too young for that, man. Sorry.
Prior to the internet, most games were either played alone or you had to get your friends over to build up like the old LAN connection. So it was a less social activity. Nowadays, it's a very social activity, but often also with randoms. So with random groups. So it also nowadays often fulfills or can fulfill a social need that people might not get met in their day-to-day life. So I often like to think about it less as addiction, but more of it being a space where needs are fulfilled that people don't get fulfilled in their real life. And because they then focus on the aspect or in the area that fulfills their need, they try, or they're not seeking it out as actively in other areas. So if your social need is met through, or met in quotation marks, through playing online with strangers, you might not go out as much and try to, for example, forge social connections in your real life, which then becomes a problem in the long run. But again, not an addiction researcher. That's the caveat here. That's my private hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, then we'll talk about the things which you are a researcher in and focus there. Should we start off with probably your current research? Or what are you currently doing?
I have an extremely broad research focus. I still do some research on ritual practice, so trying to understand how individuals experience ritual performances, how this is related to outcomes such as helping behaviors, group connections, all of the other things. I do what you could call related to ritual practice. I do research on mindfulness, both as a trait and mindfulness as a state. So some people are just generally more non-judgmental of their experiences, just in general. And then obviously there are specific practices related to states such as mindfulness practice, meditation, where people try to get into a state where they are more non-judgmental. So I work on that, and then I do stuff on personality, but that's,
What do you mean?
It's interesting, but like personality is a really wide field, and I'm not particularly sure you want to talk for extended periods about psychometrics.
Okay, so let's go with rituals and mindfulness then. Should we start off by like defining what in research you talk about? Like what is ritual or ritualistic practices when you're actually researching it?
Okay, you immediately come probably to one of the more difficult problems of rituals. Exactly what is a ritual varies highly from discipline to discipline. So I like to think about rituals as essentially a sequence of time invariant behaviors that are not fulfilling a specific purpose, that are goal demoted and that are causally opaque. So think about, for example, something like praying the rosary. You think about praying the rosary, pray for safety. You have the rosary beads go through your hand. So you do this in a repetitive fashion. It is prescribed how you do that. You always do this in the same way. There is an end goal in mind. So safety is the end goal, but it is not extremely clear. And it's also not very elaborate how praying the rosary will lead to safety. We say, oh yeah, because, it's prayer and we appeal to God. But there's no real elaborate mechanism. The issue is different disciplines think about it differently. So, for example, sociologists would say rituals are things like wedding ceremonies, funerals, things that are societally prescribed. So your individual performance will not count. And if you think about a lot of ritualized performances, so in sport, for example, a lot of players have very specific patterns of behavior they go into for example, free throws or other things that don't really improve, that don't really have a real link between their performance. So, for example, tapping a baseball bat on the ground repeatedly there's not really a link why this should improve your hit performance. And psychologists focus more on the behavioral side than on the societally prescribed side. And one of the things that where those two definitions overlap is some psychologists have also focused on rituals more along the line of you show those repetitive behaviors, but you also do them because you do a lot of repetitive behaviors actually throughout the day. If you ever go, for example, into an exam, if you had the pre-corona experience of going into a physical exam, people start fiddling with rings, with necklaces, with other things. The question is, they're not doing this really consciously. They're doing this, they're unaware of that. And so some researchers have said it's only a real ritual if you do it in a dedicated space and you essentially do it consciously, prepare for it. Often comes with specific preparations.
Mm-hmm. And what needs does it fill on the level of the individual?
It's a really interesting one. Rituals can fulfill a wide range of needs. And it depends, obviously, what you mean with on the individual level. So on the individual level, research has shown that it helps to reduce anxiety. So performance of a ritual helps to reduce anxiety. That's why we often see individual ritual being performed before highly stressful activities. So if I come back to the ring fiddling example, we see ritual or repetitive behavior arises as a result of stressful activities, but also studies that I've done show that actually this repetitive behavior reduces stress, both if you just fiddle with the ring or if you engage in a more established ritual. So we know that, for example, people that engage in praying the rosary or people that engage in reciting psalms show lower stress in high stress situations. And so anxiety reduction is one of the commonly suggested one. The other ones is that it reaffirms your connection to the group. If you take part in, let's say, the Mass, the Catholic Mass, you take part, you do the same activities with everyone around you. This can strengthen your group connection, makes you feel one with the other people around you. And there, especially when we talk about the performance of ritual in something like the Mass, often we create spaces that purposefully foster that. So if you've ever been into like a traditional European cathedral, they're giant and they're filled with gold, and you just feel extremely small in those cathedrals in comparison to just like the stunning level of wealth and awe and size. And that might make it easier to essentially lose or dissolve your ego a bit and meld more with the group. And obviously there's a wide range of different rituals that foster that.
Mm-hmm. Would that then benefit your group over other groups?
That's an evolutionary question. Some evolutionary researchers have indicated that that's one of the benefits of having ritual performances established, because it reaffirms the group cohesion, which makes you perform more unified and makes also sure that people are less likely to deviate. So that's why we might see ritual performance or group ritual performance arise in, for example, resource-deprived environments. Because in resource-deprived environments, it's more important that the group stays cohesive, because every little deviance from the group. So, for example, imagine someone steals food from your group. It's way worse in a resource-deprived environment than in a high-resource environment. And if you want to link up with someone, then that Joe Buboli has done some really interesting studies on human sacrifice in the wider cultural context, on how human sacrifice is used to establish social hierarchy and keep tight, cohesive groups in unstable environments.
Do rituals, because you just said social hierarchy, do rituals kind of reaffirm certain types of social hierarchy?
Rituals obviously reaffirm how the group is often now. So, and some researchers, for example, Catherine Bell, have written about an interesting paradox. Often ritual performers in high ordeal rituals are people from the fringes of societies. So people that are being marginalized, or people that normally have less rights in society. So she specifically talks about the role of women in rituals. Often in rituals, women get roles that they do not have access to in the wider society. So leading roles, interpretive roles, spiritual roles. And the interesting thing is, so they have power within the ritual, which is good for them as an individual because it brings them back into society, but it also reaffirms the overall structure of society that in a wider context deprives them of those rights again. So there's this really interesting dichotomy going on. And a lot of rituals can be society structure reinforcing.
Mm-hmm. But they come often at a sacrifice, right? Like some of them would be quite hard to perform.
Rituals range from, you think about it in this terms. Rituals exist on a spectrum. They exist from, let's call them benign. So Christmas, the worst thing that happens on Christmas is that you have to talk to your extremely annoying aunt. Like that can be painful, but like I would describe it as like a 3 out of 10 on the pain scale. But there are some extremely high ordeal rituals. So Ronald Fisher, Professor Ronald Fisher nowadays, has done research on vegetarian festivals in Thailand, where people pierce their faces with swords, walk over burning coals. And those extreme pain rituals increase the tendency of people to reaffirm their connection to the group. So if you see an extreme pain ritual, you're more likely to, for example, donate more to your group than if you see a low ordeal ritual. So the pain element is important. And there's an important caveat that I always like to put here, and comes back to the old question about westernized psychology. Often when we think about extreme pain rituals, we like to push it away into other cultures. It's something that happens somewhere else like this. It always has like this weird, we are civilization touch to it. But extreme pain rituals also exist in, and have always existed in Western cultures. So if you think about the flagellants in medieval times, which used to whip themselves during the plague times to essentially show their suffering and show their sinfulness, similar practices still exist in Italy. So there are religious processions where people hit themselves with sponges filled with needles. That's quite common. And they both exist in a secular and in a religious space. So there are also secular pain rituals. And they exist globally. It's not something that, we sometimes have the thing that when researchers look at that, they like to relegate it to non-Western cultures, but pain rituals exist everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You just mentioned the secular part. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Because you talked about like secularism playing a role, are there any rituals which are pretty secular, or are most of them just based in some sort of faith or religion?
The interesting question is, what is religion?
Well, we can start there then, if you really want to.
There are a lot of secular rituals. So think about New Year's Eve. We build rituals around how New Year's Eve should work. And sure, like in some cultures, it's referred not as New Year's Eve, but as Saint Sylvester, so that technically is a religious holiday. But normally it's referred to as New Year's Eve. And that's a non-religious ritual practice. We throw fireworks, we count the thing down, all of those. There are also pain rituals that are secular. If you think about, for example, US hazing rituals, they reaffirm group membership, and the people subjecting to themselves can gain group membership, but they are secular by default. Think about sports events. The same thing. Specific chants that have to be done. There have to be all of those things. People don specific attire for it, like you put on the team scarf to lift the team spirit, which is very similar to putting on your good Sunday church clothes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so then where does the line between rituals and superstition? Is there a line between the two of them?
Superstition is a really interesting one. And if you had Mark in here, or will get Mark in here, I don't know.
Oh, he was the first.
Yeah, Mark was
Has he talked about superstition?
A little bit. Like he touched on it.
So, for example, the interesting thing about superstition is what actually is superstition. Because we often talk about superstitious behavior, but we sometimes talk about superstition when it's about others' belief system. And there's a historian at Harvard who has written a really interesting book about inventing superstition, where he talks about can we talk, for example, about the ancient Greek gods as supernatural beings, which comes to the idea of superstition a bit. So it's beyond the realm of the normal. And he says, well, they are supernatural for us, they're not supernatural for the ancient Greeks. For the ancient Greeks, they lived physically out in the real world. And if you think about it, there are a lot of things that you too think live out in the world that you have never seen. Like, very few people have seen actual real wolves or touched an actual real wolf. You just accept that wolves are real and live somewhere out in the forest. Wolves are not supernatural creatures, but you have as little personal evidence about wolves. Sure, you have seen a picture, you've seen a video of a wolf.
Yep.
But, so the question is, are wolves supernatural creatures? And so that's the interesting thing. We often think about in psychology as a lot of definitions as extremely hard, but they're actually quite blurry. And same goes with rituals and superstitions. Superstitions are, I like to think about them as they are present in a cultural context, but they're not universally endorsed in a culture. So think about, for example, the cats thing, the black cats thing, or the going under ladders thing. We are all aware that it is a belief that exists, but not everyone ascribes to it to a same level. So I think superstitions are often more individualized, and then often the behavior around it is more idiosyncratic often. So especially, for example, how much you avoid black cats. You should avoid them if they cross, if you believe in it, but how much you avoid them is kind of up to you. So yeah, superstitions, rituals are more hard and time invariant than superstitions.
It came up because your example of sports teams and sports players like for example, making sure that like the water bottles are lined up in a certain way before a game and all those things, do they come under superstitions or rituals then because they're practice?
You can also separate it. Yeah, you can separate it out in superstition if you think about the belief, and ritual if you think about it in that sense in the practice. So Gemelk in the 1970s has written a number of papers called Baseball Magic, where he looks at that and looks at the potential performance effects of idiosyncratic rituals performed by athletes. And athletes that perform their rituals actually perform better. And one of the things is it might help you to focus your mind on the task ahead. It might reduce your anxiety, but it might also increase your self-efficacy beliefs because you are in control. It gives you the idea of control. You lined up your water bottles correctly. They are now all the correct height. So you've done everything that you can. So you are now in charge, which is interesting to think about. So yeah, superstition and rituals can be linked, but not every superstition has a ritual attached to it, and not every ritual has a superstition on the other side.
I wonder when it then verges on like mental illness, but I suppose it depends on the context. Yeah.
One of the really interesting implications, for example, giving a short background, one of the most common ideas in ritual research since the early days is that rituals quell anxiety. And that rituals arise as part of anxiety. So Bronislaw Malinowski, when he wrote The Argonauts of the Western Pacific, he traveled to the Trobriand Brand Islands, then World War I broke out, then he was trapped there, then he got a grant from the Australian government, which is really weird because he was essentially a prisoner there. So that's a bit odd. And he observed a really interesting thing. He watched the Trobriand Brand Islanders, and they had two different fishing spots. They had the lagoon, which is very calm and good chance of returning. And they had the ocean. And if they went out to the ocean is extremely dangerous. And it's extremely unsure if you will make it back with a lot of fish or no fish. And he observed that when the fishermen went to the lagoon, they performed no ritual at all. If they went to the extremely dangerous ocean, they performed a lot of ritual. They engaged in magical performances. They made new boats. They specifically blessed those boats. And so he came up with the idea that anxiety gives rise to rituals. And I've tested this a few years ago with students here at Victoria. So students came in and they had to do something called the TRIA social stress test.
What's that?
The TRIA social stress test is, as we do it here in our lab, is a variant of a procedure where you come in and you're, I don't want to know how much I tell you. It's a stress-inducing task where you have to do a counting performance that is stress-inducing. And we've recorded participants' hand motion. So we did skeletal tracking and tracked how they moved their hands, and they got to clean an object. And people in the stress condition showed substantially more movement that was repetitive, so they did the same movement over and over. So they started essentially to do the same fiddling motion over and over, supporting the idea that stress gives rise to ritual performance. But the interesting thing is also people that did that showed lower stress, biologic stress afterwards. They had a lower heart rate after they did that fiddling ritual, and they had lower blood pressure. So there is something to that stress reduction. And coming back to your question on mental health, when we published that, one of the most common questions we got from reviewers, what about autism, was about OCD. And the interesting thing is, if this ritualized behavior is resulting from anxiety, this has some interesting mental health implications, because if you think about quite old and less endorsable therapy approaches that try to suppress, for example, the fiddling behavior in children with ASD, we might actually suppress an anxiety-reducing mechanism in them. So not only are we not really helping them, we're also causing harm by taking away a mechanism that helps them to regulate anxiety. So it might be that they fiddle because they actually experience anxiety.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting thing. And it would be quite interesting in the future for more people to to more narrowly separate out what is anxiety-based ritual performance and what is other ritualized performance based on belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I thought often with the nervousness, I heard that it's like just your nervous system creating energy that you need to sort of...
Yeah, the energy, the solution idea. It's or what's called the homeostatic idea that you need to get rid of surplus energy. I always found it quite interesting because if you think from an evolutionary principle, the body doesn't really like to waste energy.
But wouldn't it be in that context it'd be important to say run away or...
Yeah, fight flight.
Yeah.
But fight flight is anxiety. Well, it's not anxiety, it's anxiety is different from fight or flight, but it is very similar. It's what's the English word for it? It's a behavioral regulation. Some other researchers had a really interesting idea related to energy and those fiddling behaviors. One of them is that it increases the predictability of future states. If you do very repetitive behavior, you have a better understanding what the state of the future will be, making it easier to predict the future state. If you know, I have to clean this object 7 times, you know that you still have 6 cleanings to do, you still have 5 cleanings to do. And the idea is that that goes a bit in the line of Lisa Barrett-Feldman's work on that we actually deal in psychology terms a lot more with prediction than we think. And so some researchers have thought that ritualized performance might help us to reduce stress by increasing the predictability of future states.
That's very interesting.
Are there any rituals which show or any such ritualistic practices which show more benefits than others in terms of
it depends what you mean with benefits. The fire walking ritual is extremely beneficial to societies because otherwise they would not perform it. Because it reaffirms group membership, it helps them to make sense of their surroundings, so it is highly beneficial to them.
No, I meant more in terms of the mental health context. And if you're trying to reduce a certain type of repetitive behavior, is there another repetitive behavior which would probably be more beneficial?
If I have to give a tentative answer on that, it's obviously better to perform a non-destructive repetitive behavior than perform a destructive repetitive behavior. So if you think about some of the stuff that Mark does with self-injury, with the rubber band that people snap if they feel anxiety rather than engage in, for example, skin picking or scratching, which is also a form of repetition. You might be able to switch it out against a different repetitive behavior, which is less destructive. So, and if you think about it, fulfills a very similar need. You get to pick away at something, you get to do the repetition, but you engage in less physical destruction.
So if, practically speaking, if I have a ritual that I do, every time I get anxious or before I have to present something, that's okay? I shouldn't try to alter it. I just should understand that that's a natural part.
Again, that's like with superstitions. Superstitions, if you think, for example, that picking up a penny, Stuart Weiss talks about if you're picking up a penny brings you luck and will make you perform well in an exam, picking up the penny is completely fine. The chance that you catch something from picking up the penny is pre-pandemic low. Also post-pandemic, I think. The thing is, Stuart Weiss actually talks about this really interesting case of a student who could not sit an exam until they found a penny. They scoured the city trying to find a penny on the ground and they missed their exams. That is a ritualized behavior that I would then curb. So curb your enthusiasm there.
They probably need help there.
Yeah, exactly. But if it's...
Can they not throw a penny down themselves and pick it up?
No, because that goes into the question of authenticity. And that's a really interesting one. What makes a ritual authentic? Because not any old behavior works. And Christine Legar and others have looked at Brazilian healing rituals, so simpatias, which are small behavioral performances meant to treat illnesses. And they have looked into what makes people believe that a made-up ritual works. And one of the reasons is it has more steps of repetition. It's clearer when you have to perform it and how you have to perform it. So specificity, which we see also with with our individual rituals. And one of the really interesting things is they found that if it uses already established ritual components from other rituals, so religious imagery, for example, it works better. And we see a transferal effect. If an object or a behavior is already part of an authentic ritual, it can pass on some of that authenticity to a different ritual. If you've ever seen a mafia movie, for example.
A what movie?
A mafia.
Right, yeah.
And people swear the oath of silence, the omerta. They get out the picture of the Mother Mary, put the blood on it, and then light it on fire. There's no reason why the picture of the Mother Mary is there. The Mother Mary is historically and religiously not really associated with either silence or truth or anything. But it is an important religious image in a belief system that already everyone in this group tends to buy into, if they're Catholics. So using this image from a different ritual and from a already established belief canon imbues authenticity and power into the other ritual. And that's quite interesting. And we see this quite a lot also when we talk about slander from, for example, one belief group to another belief group. A very common libelous accusation is Satanists steal the host, also the Eucharist, and use it in their dark mass. And it's like, okay, cool, but why? What's the point? But because the Eucharist is so important in normal Christian performance, and it has so much powerful ritual significance that, it makes sense that it imbues this other ritual with power. And it's quite interesting how those link together. So authenticity is a crucial factor in ritual performance. And if you violate the authenticity of a ritual, people are quite upset about that.
Do you think that rituals could have a placebo effect, like what you're talking about before with some kind of like medical ritual in Brazil?
Yeah. And there is obviously, because I'm personally a skeptic, I do not believe that the rituals have a causal effect. So I believe that it is because people believe in the effectiveness of the ritual that it works. And the interesting thing is, we sometimes think that we modern psychologists are the first ones that came up with that idea. Very early Renaissance writers have talked about that. So dentistry used to be a horrifying process in the past. And writers like Cardano, for example, have talked about toothache charms. And even Renaissance writers were quite clear, and they believed in magic to some extent, that some toothache charms work by what he calls their own faiths and beliefs. So via placebo effect. He says there is nothing happening, there's no magic happening, it's just because the person believes that the toothache charm will help them. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I find quite interesting. We sometimes think we're really the first one to think about it. Like,
we're the first ones to publish it in inaccessible manners.
Exactly. We the first ones to charge $300 for access.
Yeah. What's the most interesting out of all the research you've done in the area of ritual? What's the most interesting thing that you found or tidbit of information you've come across?
One of the most interesting things that I found is actually I had quite a joy some time ago to work with colleagues in India on Diwali. So how much time people spend performing activities for Diwali rituals. And what I found really interesting, because I never really thought about that, is, sure, investing time into the ritual is good because, you get to connect with your community and you feel authentic, and it's also partially fun. But the interesting thing is it's a curvilinear effect. Once you start investing too much time into it and you spend going from like house to house to house to house and you visit like 20,000 different nuns, it just becomes extremely draining. So you can overperform rituals, which I never really thought about in that sense. But if you think about it, it makes sense. And I found it quite interesting. And that's something that it's not that thought about.
Yeah, I guess, the time consumption aspect of it as well, isn't it?
Because
you're almost like inhibiting yourself from doing anything else if you're focusing purely on that for a period.
And the interesting thing is, if you ever have watched any Hallmark movie, or any Christmas movie, any American Christmas movie, it is such a common trope of like the mother completely freaking out because she spent like the last 3 months organizing like the perfect Christmas, and she has done nothing else but organize the perfect Christmas. And we are kind of aware of that people really want to perform rituals well, but sometimes they just overdo it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I find quite interesting.
I was going to say, are there any rituals that you perform? And can you analyze them? No.
Okay, that could be interpreted two ways. Either yes, but people should not know about them for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
I'm a true private man.
Yeah. So you said that you've done a bit of, you've done work on rituals before, and all your research, you've mentioned it. Do you plan on doing more in the future as well? Are there any aspects of rituals which you'd like to look at which you haven't yet?
There are quite some aspects of rituals that I'm interested in. So I'm interested also going away from the more like religious focused rituals. So some of the stuff that we've done, like community focused rituals like Diwali or firewalking or others, often religiously affiliated. I'm also quite interested in more, and then we come into like the spooky area. I'm more interested in rituals around alternative states. And not people like taking ayahuasca in the jungle, but think about stuff like scrying, for example. So mirror gazing, where people look into the mirror and they think they're communicating with other entities. It's set up, it's a specific ritual performance. It comes with an altered state of mind. And the interesting thing is the practice emerges all over different cultures. So most cultures have a practice where you look into a water bowl, or you look into a crystal, or you look into a reflective surface. And that's really interesting because there's a really interesting intersection of psychology, because you have visual, attention, and perceptual psychology. You have cross-cultural psychology, or like cultural psychology that shapes the belief around it. And you also have some basic processes around ritual performance, individual differences that might make some people more susceptible to interact with those shining surfaces. And that's a really interesting intersection. And I think that's why rituals in principle are so interesting, because often we chop up psychological phenomena into our neat silos. We're like, oh yeah, we investigate this from a perceptual perspective, or we investigate this from a cross-cultural perspective. And rituals really benefit from a merging of perspectives, because they're such closely clustered together things of many different psychological areas that it's just fun to work at them, because you get to work with many, many different people from different psychology areas that you normally don't. Mm-hmm. There's some research in ritual performance in rats, by the way. They also tried the stress thing with rats. So they put a mesh over some, I think, gerbils. It's gerbils. And they put meat on top of the net and then had owls above the net. And so the owls kept swooping down all night on those gerbils, which was extremely stressful for the gerbils. They did not enjoy it. And they found that the gerbils show more cleaning behavior afterwards and huddle closer together after they were swooped on. And especially like the repetitive, non-productive cleaning part is quite interesting. So indicating that it might be something that's not only cross-culturally working, but also might be something that is quite ancient in our evolutionary history.
Yeah.
And is it easier to look at from an outsider perspective, like the more distance you have from something that's happening, like looking at a little gerbil?
Yeah. Comes back to the question of indigenous psychology, for example, versus cross-cultural psychology. And I think the cool thing is, because rituals are also a space where those two can interact, because you make different calls. If you say, I am interested in how, for example, the behavioral feature, just the literal behavior, emerges across cultural context. That's really cool from a cross-cultural perspective, but you can't really give a deeper insight into why specific, for example, ritual elements have meaning. So coming back to what makes a ritual authentic, often as a cultural outsider, you don't really know about the significance of specific elements. And I think that's really where a lot of those cultural research areas interact well, because they look at the same phenomena and can contribute answers that are mutually enhancing each other, because it takes away some of the elements that might be cross-culturally universal, that you're like, okay, cool. I don't really focus on those as an indigenous psychologist right now. I focus on the parts that are truly unique, and you can add a lot of information and insight there that no one else can contribute.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one good example of that, which Dr. Hassan mentioned when she was on, was about like Shia Muslims, where they cut themselves with blades during like a specific month, a specific time of the year, in solidarity with the pain of one of the Prophet's grandkids.
Yeah.
And comes to the thing where like if you're just looking at it from an outsider's perspective, you're just looking at people just blading themselves together.
Yeah.
But then I guess if you looked at it from a more cultural perspective, you'd see like relevance or meaning in the action.
Yeah. And like that's where I think the interesting overflow is similar is with, like, for example, Sufi mysticism. Like you can look at it as, it's achieving like the dancing and achieves an alternative state of mind. I'm like, cool. But you miss a lot of the significance of why the specific practices are being performed. And that's quite interesting. Which, by the way, then also goes into the question how rituals actually change. Because obviously, if you specifically talk, for example, about Islam, practices and rituals change between groups and over time. And that's also really something where cultural insiders can really lend a lot of information on how this process might have worked that is not really accessible with cross-cultural comparison.
So would the rituals change in accordance to what that society needs, or their...
It can change to needs, it can change to availability. So imagine like your ritual needs a specific component and you, for example, get sent into the diaspora, so Jewish diaspora, and you don't have access to an element of your ritual anymore. Your community needs to agree on what is the authentic replacement. And that's probably one of the last things on rituals. Researchers have looked into what happens when you violate this communal agreed practice. So specifically on Jewish practice, if you remember how Passover works, you retell the story of the Jewish people and you get a plate with different dishes and they are essentially eaten in accordance with the part of the story, provides a physical sensation to the story being told, and contains stuff like normally like chopped apples and nuts or bitter herbs or a lamb shank. And some researchers have looked into what happens when you, and it's nowhere written down that that's the way that plate should be. What happens if you change this community-agreed plate out against other food items? The lamb shank against the Big Mac and the apples against cookies. Yeah, again, I'm not slandering a lamb shank, but again, not for me because I'm vegetarian, but a Big Mac is supposedly better than a lamb shank, supposedly. Or
Depends
lamb
how
rump.
it's cooked.
And the interesting thing is, people see it both as upsetting and immoral, and then would ostracize others if they change this plate. So if they don't stand or if they don't adhere to the community embrace standard of what this should be like. And the interesting thing is, one violation is too many. So we don't really see, and they tried to change all of the elements of the plate, and they asked, so is this more immoral? Is this more immoral? And it's really the first violation. So once you violate the authenticity of the ritual and you just slap on a Big Mac, people are like, yeah, it's just not the same, man. It's just... And one of the really interesting things then is, how do communities come to the agreement of what should be, for example, on this plate? And that's really something where, for example, psychologists, historians and sociologists can interact with each other, because the correct performance of the ritual is important to individuals. We know that if people don't perform rituals correctly, that can have detrimental effects. Funeral rites. We know that if people don't have the chance to take part in the culturally prescribed funeral rite, it can have some long-term consequences. They might experience longer periods of feelings of loss and of unresolved grief. And that nicely segues into essentially the last concern where it comes back when rituals get transported between cultures. And burial rites are quite interesting there. So if you think about traditional Muslim burial, in Germany, you have the issue that it is technically not allowed because you have to go into the wooden box. To go into the wooden box and you have to go all the way down. And so you can't perform some funerary rites or also around display. Or imagine societies would start deciding that we only allow fire burial. Some religious groups do not condone fire burial as a traditional form of burial. And that's really interesting. So also when people go with their ritual into another place and try to perform it in a different place, that can be a very difficult spot where people, societies, and the ritual practices interact.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. And would part of it as well be respect for your ancestors as well and how they would do the same practice?
Yeah, but like the interesting thing is we always modify our rituals a tiny bit. So if you celebrate, for example, Christmas, how much singing of Christmas carols do you still do around the table? Yeah. Like even in my lifetime, that has severely declined. And so it's always a negotiation process. It's not only a negotiation process between contemporary groups, it's also a negotiation process up and down the chain. And it always needs to be, we sometimes then also re-emphasize different parts of the ritual. So the communal singing was important because it brings people together, spreads joy. Now we emphasize up different parts of the ritual. So, for example, like the gift giving and the family being together and the together eating part. To replace the other declined ritual elements. So rituals are also always in flux internally.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great place to end. Thanks so much for your insight into rituals. The last thing which we do with all our guests is we have a list of few quick fire questions which we'll ask you and answer them. Feel free to answer them whichever way you want. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, let's go.
We won't be offended if you say no.
Yeah. What is your OnlyFans?
Oh, that would be a difficult one. To be honest, the president of the Tropic Biological Society has a Cameo account where you can book him to wish your friends happy birthday, and he collects money via that for the rainforest. So,
Oh, that's
wow.
Nice.
That sounds like a great business idea.
It's also a very specific one. Like if the man would send me a birthday greeting, I'm like, who are you?
Yeah. Not very well known.
Yeah, well, we can start doing that as well. Too.
Oh, we can do happy birthday.
Happy birthday from the Smooth.
Like, who are these people?
All right. Let's start then. Summer or winter?
Winter.
Movies or TV shows?
None of the two. TV shows.
You don't like them?
Not particularly, no.
Well, then the next question is pointless, isn't it? If your life was a movie, what genre would it be?
Obviously, the best and most rational answer is a documentary, given that life is in itself a documentary, but it's okay.
Morning, noon, or night?
Night.
Outdoors or indoors?
One question. Humanity strive to get away from the outdoors, so it's definitely indoors.
Cats or dogs?
Definitely cats.
Which weighs heavier, a ton of feathers or a ton of steel?
The question is, where are we? Also depends what do you mean with heavy? Do you mean the weight heavy, or do you mean my subjective feeling of heavy? And then it depends what shape the steel is in, and are the feathers bunched together. If the feathers are bunched together, then they're probably easier to hold than the steel if the steel is not in a shape that will cut my hands. So again, the question is, do you mean objective heavy or subjective heavy?
It was however you wanted to interpret it.
That's very philosophical. No one's broken it down like that.
Yeah. Which superpower would you like to have?
None. I want exactly no superpower because I don't want to be abducted by the military and have experiments conducted on me, because that's the first thing that will happen if people find out you have a superpower. I would hate that. And before you know it, you're part of some horrifying lab experiments. And I like to do the experimenting, not be the experimented on.
So you'd be the one, if you ever got a chance to like test people with superpowers.
Yeah, I would love to test people with superpowers. It would be fascinating. Goes into my interest on ESP, but no, thank you, I don't. I'm quite
USP?
ESP, extrasensory perception.
What's that?
Clairvoyance, the ability to see the future. If you want to get Mark back, have him talk about the ESP, which is fascinating.
Is a hot dog a sandwich?
I on the sandwich chart, I am both a structure purist and an ingredients anarchist. And I firmly believe that a hot dog is not a sandwich for the following reason. A hot dog is not a sandwich because the bun is attached at the hinge, which means it's not two separate pieces of carbohydrate. It's one piece of carbohydrate. That's also why a wrap is not a sandwich.
What about a Subway sub? That's not a sandwich as well, is it?
A Subway sub is not even technically food.
Why not?
Have you ever looked up how much sugar a Subway sandwich contains?
No.
I cannot recommend that. Also, it's not food.
And so like any paninis or anything which is like attached bread is not.
Not a sandwich. It needs to be two pieces of carbohydrates. That's why an ice cream sandwich is a sandwich. Because the ingredients don't matter. It is the two-piesedness of bread.
Yeah.
That's why we specify open-faced sandwich is different from regular sandwich. It is about the number of carbohydrate pieces. That's why a Big Mac is also not really a sandwich because it doesn't have two.
Well, there's three. It's like a club sandwich.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we also specify that the club sandwich is a specific subtype of the two breaded.
So would a cheeseburger be a sandwich?
Cheeseburger is indeed a sandwich. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I respect this. I respect the breakdown. Thank you.
I feel like you're the new authority on sandwiches.
I have thought about that question more than a regular human being because it has some interesting philosophical and measurement implications.
You've been waiting for this question your whole life.
I answer this question more often than you believe.
Oh.
What's your favorite food or cuisine?
Ooh, I'm mostly a traditionalist. I enjoy the things that I grew up with. So it's probably like Bavarian-style pancakes. It's probably Bavarian-style pancake soup, which makes people extremely angry.
How do pancakes go into a soup?
Well, you take the pancakes and you integrate them into the soup.
So like soggy bread and soup?
So our pancakes are substantially thinner. So imagine them in like two crepes strung together. And you also have what's it called? Noodle soup. You just cut them finely and chuck them into the old soup, and off you go. Bing bam boom, noodle soup.
If you could be any animal, what would it be?
I'm quite fond of birds. So any type of bird would be fine. There's some birds that I don't want to be, especially the endangered ones, because I enjoy being alive. But yeah, pick any kind of bird. I have a fondness for African greys. They're quite good. Sparrows are underrated birds.
Really? Well, I guess they're so common. So people are like,
Yeah, exactly. But sparrows are pretty dope if you think about them. If you spend some time going outside and studying sparrows, they have a really interesting variety. They're a quality bird.
So they're quite smart?
No. No. They're like literally like nature's. Because nature needed to fill a bit of space with living entities, and it was like, I don't have a lot of cognitive function left, so let's make some sparrows.
Yeah.
But they're fine. Also have a heart for pigeons, because it's not pigeons' fault that they're so shitty.
Yeah.
We built an environment that made them shitty.
How so?
Well, if you think about the common rock pigeon, it was a happy bird all along. It like lived in its like rock cliffs doing bird stuff. And, now it has to live in shitty cities where it loses 90% of its toes.
Why does it lose its toes?
I don't know. I think they peck them off.
Oh. Is it stressed?
It's stress. It's possibly also rats. And birds have this weird thing. If the parent birds get really stressed, they sometimes disable their children.
Oh my god.
They bite off claws or parts of the wing if they get extremely stressed.
And they're associated with being like dirty as well.
Yeah, they are. But like again, they're not dirty in nature. In nature, they're just regular ass birds.
Oh, I've never seen them like in nature and not just like
Look
in
up
the city.
rock dove. They're quite nice.
Okay. Yeah.
Pigeon.
What quote or saying do people spout, but you think is complete bullshit?
Most of them.
Yeah.
90% of sayings are complete nonsense. What is probably the biggest one? It's like just anything that has to do with astrology, man. Just literally anything.
It's become such a big thing. I don't know how.
And it's interesting. It's a true revival, and astrology comes and goes. And the really interesting thing about astrology now is that it is a belief system rather than, because it used to be a science.
Yeah.
And it used to be part of philosophy. So if you think about the Mu'tazilites, so early Islamic philosophers, they spent a lot of time thinking about astrology because they were like, okay, cool. So how is the plan in the world actually enacted? Cool. So what if the stars manipulate things on Earth and then just the stars are move kind of like knobs? And they're like, cool. So if you pay real good attention to the stars, you might figure out what happens on Earth. And so that's where a lot of the astrological beliefs in different societies comes from, that they thought that the stars are essentially easier to study as being moved by the prime movers. Mm-hmm. And now it's more of like a feel-good thing.
Or it seems like a thing so people can understand what's going on, or like a control thing.
Yeah. Again, it's just, I personally don't believe in any form of astrology. That's why I also don't believe in the Myers-Briggs test or in any other.
It's up there in your mind with astrology.
It is roughly on the same level of astrology. If you ever go to a job interview and they give you the Myers-Briggs test, I can highly recommend informing them that it is conceptually faulty, shows no good measurement properties, and immediately leave this place of work and never return.
Mm-hmm.
That's the soundbite. Life advice.
What is your version of there are two types of people in this world?
You mean what two types of people I believe exist? People that believe in the statement that there are two types of people in the world, and people that see people as people and not as members of weird grouped entities?
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
That's a very meta answer.
Yeah, but like it is essentially that. There are people that see people as people and people that see first and foremost people as members of groups. And you can decide whether you want to be a decent human being or not.
Mm-hmm. If you were not doing this, what would you be doing?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. So if I had to stay in academia, I would become a biologist and relive my dream. If I can't be a biologist, I would be a chemist. If I can't be a chemist, I would be a computer scientist. If I can't be any of those, I'm going to be a chocolatier. Not because I like a chocolatier. I make things out of chocolate. I don't like chocolate, so that's good for me. So I'm not going to eat my work. I do not enjoy any forms of chocolate. So that's good. Otherwise, I will probably drive one of those like deconstructy ball swingy machines.
In a wreckage.
Yeah, a wrecking ball. That's what it's called.
You go.
Yeah, that's a dope job. If you just get paid, you have to do none of the cleanup, but you just get to run over houses. It's like an A-level job.
Yeah. What type of researcher is most likely to win a drinking contest, and why is it a cross-cultural researcher?
Why would a cross-cultural researcher win? Well, again, drinking rituals are very common across many different places. So if you interact with many different cultures, it's quite likely that you will drink a lot, and you will also have a substantial exposure to different spirits, so you will be able to build up a tolerance to. So that would be my answer there. Next ranked are obviously the rat researchers, because, they already have to forget the horrifying things that they do on a day-to-day basis.
You're not wrong.
I like to be right.
And lastly, if you could give us one piece of advice to leave us with, what would it be?
Brush your teeth every evening. Dental health is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Brush them also in the morning.
Yeah.
Floss regularly.
Yeah. I'm noting it down.
Yeah. There's some good advice, just generally. Read more things that are not psychology. I think most psychologists could profit from, so it's specifically advice to psychologists, read more things that are not specifically psychology and that are not feelings-based. Read things from other disciplines, biologists, Merlin Sheldrake's book, The Entangled Life, I can highly recommend. It's on fungi and how fungi are essentially pervasive throughout the world. Which is, I think it's quite good for psychologists to get a perspective on just the richness of life outside of the human mind, because otherwise psychologists get too stuck in the mind and too stuck in like the old thinky globe.
All right. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Karl, for joining us. Thanks again, everyone, for listening.
And if people are interested in what you do, how can they follow you or contact you?
That's why the email system was invented. If you try to find me on Twitter, you can read my papers that I find interesting, right-click retweet, so I remember them. And otherwise emails exist. johannes.karl@vuw.ac.nz. Sorry, johannes.karl@vuw.ac.nz. I am still a research associate adjunct research fellow at VUW.
Easy.
Great.
Oh,
Don't try to find out where I live.
okay. Cool. Thanks again. Make sure you don't find out where Johannes Karl lives.
I don't like that.
He doesn't like that. And until then, everyone maintain good dental hygiene. And psychologists don't read about psychology.
And drink more water. Everyone should drink more water.
Thank you. So insightful.
Thank you.
Thank you.